how is that water sticking to a spinning planet, to a rotating planet? How is the planet rotating around and keeping all the water with it, keeping all the water attracted to it as it moves in a constant rotation? And this is where we got to look at centripetal force, or uniform circular motion. Rotating an object in a 360-degree motion, creating a force that keeps everything contained within it. Everything, including water. You can add any amount of water to the inside of that object, any depth, any volume, any number of gallons. And once you have that water contained and you send whatever is containing it into a 360-degree circular motion, the water will remain inside, attached to that object. As long as you keep that object in that precise 360-degree revolution, that constant uniform circular motion, water will remain contained within it. It isn't until you stop that circular motion, disrupt that circular motion, that water is no longer contained and begins to fall, because it's no longer moving with the circular motion of that object, the circular path of that object. The first law of motion: an object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. As long as that object stays in that 360-degree circular rotation, centripetal force is created, keeping the water attached to that object, locked into that rotating circular frame. And again, it isn't until that consistent revolution is disrupted that the water is no longer attached, that it is no longer contained. But that rotation creates centripetal force, which literally means center seeking. Centripetal, center seeking. So when we're talking about centripetal force, we're talking about a center seeking force, a force that is pulling everything toward the central point of rotation, causing everything to be attracted to the center of rotation. Again, that 360-degree motion creates a fixed central point that everything is attracted to. Basically a force right at the center that keeps everything within that frame of rotation attached, locked in, keeping it locked in and centrally balanced as it follows that uniform circular motion, following the constant circular motion of that container. Again, a force is being created at the center or the radius of that circular rotation, keeping everything within it attached to it. No matter where it is within that frame of 360-degree rotation, it always remains attached, centrally balanced, centrally locked. Very similar to gravity, that center seeking force, pulling everything toward the center of the rotating earth, no matter where it is on that sphere. We got very similar physics going on, to the point where within physics, centripetal force or uniform circular motion is sometimes referred to as artificial gravity. But because again, the bulk of that force is at the center, keeping everything attached as that object rotates, forcing everything within it to follow a curved path and move around that curved path in a continuous circular motion, all while staying attached to a rotating object, sticking to a rotating object. No matter what you contain the water in, it's about that rotating force created by circular motion. And of course, your arm swinging the object is creating the centripetal force, creating the circular motion that is keeping everything attached to that net force of that rotation. And of course, just like the more force that you put into that swing, the more centripetal force that is created. Same way, the more mass that a rotating object has, the more centripetal force it exerts. The force that is keeping everything attached is also keeping everything even and level. So even as water moves with that 360-degree rotation, it remains level, because as it rotates with that object, It is always seeking the center, keeping it level and even. It's creating inertia, constant uniformity with that object, perfect synchronicity with that object, and everything, including water, follows that path of inertia or the circular motion of that object without splashing or spilling or being disrupted. And some people are going to look at this and say, a bucket or a cup, whatever container you place that water into is not the oceans, not comparable to the oceans on Earth, because the water on Earth is supposed to be sitting on the globe. It's sitting on top of this round globe Earth. As the globe spins, the water is sitting on top of it. In reality, none of the water on Earth is sitting on top of the Earth. All of the ocean water sits within the seabed, sits within the ocean basins. All of the water on Earth sits within pockets and crevices, sits within depressions in the Earth. And the deeper the depression, the deeper the seabed, the deeper the basin, the deeper the water, the deeper the ocean, the deeper that body of water is. It's not just magically floating on top of a smooth ball the way some people are perceiving it. You got some people taking basketballs, tennis balls, toy globes, spinning them around, pouring water on them, and asking why the water is not sticking. Clearly not understanding that water is not sitting on top of the Earth. It sits within the Earth. Water is not sitting onto the Earth, magically sitting on top of this smooth spinning ball. Again, water is not sitting on top of the Earth. It sits within the Earth, in the crevices of the Earth, in the ocean basins, sitting within the ocean bed, sitting deep down in the ocean bed. And because it's sitting within it, sitting within the Earth, it's susceptible to all the forces acting on the Earth. All those forces are able to influence water as it sits within the planet, including any forces created by motion, by rotation, by uniform circular motion, which would cause all of the water on Earth to move uniformly with the planet, which is exactly what we see with centripetal force. Water attaching itself to that rotating object and moving with it in perfect synchronicity for as long as that force is acting on it. And we know ultimately centripetal force is produced from circular motion or circular acceleration, which is producing that force on the water, pushing it down into a level state and keeping it in that state of rest or uniformity because of the inertia created by that force. Again, keeping it even and level and undisturbed, even while following that curved path, that path of rotation. No matter where it is on that curved path, it remains undisturbed, unmoved, because of the force being produced at the center, at the central point of rotation. And because of that force acting on it, that object can move in any direction, any 360-degree trajectory, any circular orientation. And the state of that water will not change. Again, it remains even, level, undisturbed, and completely attached to that rotating object, locked to that object, no matter what circular path or trajectory you send it into, as that force created by motion keeps it locked in, moving in any direction, as long as that direction is circular or 360 degrees, as long as you have uniform circular motion at any angle, at any speed, that object will rotate around that center of mass, creating that force. You can see how centripetal force would help to keep that uniformity, to sustain that uniformity through rotation at any speed in any angle. And even though the earth is not rotating at 1,000 miles per hour and moving around the sun at 67,000 miles per hour, with centripetal force, with that constant rotation, constant circular motion, it really wouldn't matter how it orbits or how fast it orbits. Water is still going to stick to that spinning, rotating object once that force is produced on it. Again, any angle, any speed, the key component is that force. As long as you have space for that object to move within, and centripetal force is established on it, that force stays with it, continues to influence that object, even in free fall, or as long as it is able to move within that space in a rotating motion, that force will influence it, which is letting you know that it is the rotation of that object that is stabilizing that force, keeping everything, including water, on it. And it doesn't have to be done in those short circular motions, in those small increments. Centripetal force can be created and maintained even with longer, wider paths of circular motion. As long as the path of that object is a rotating path, 360 degrees, has the potential to produce that force and maintain it. That longer path and wider trajectory still conforms to centripetal force. Even with those wider swings, those wider orbits, inertia is still produced on that object as it rotates, on that water as it rotates, keeping it attached to that very wide, very spread out rotating object, moving with it uniformly on that long expanded path of rotation. Even on that astronomically long trajectory, that force still remains perfectly stable, perfectly intact. You can shift the length of that circular path, steadily winding it down and decreasing it. And as long as that path is uniform, consistently 360 degrees, that force will stay intact, keeping everything influenced by it intact. Every single thing attached to that object, no matter the amount, no matter the quantity, every single thing on that rotating object will stick to that rotating object because of the force enacted on it. Even multiple vessels, multiple enclosures of water are influenced by that force, attracting them to that spinning object and keeping them attached to it for as long as that circular motion is produced. Again, anything attached to that object will be influenced by the force acting on it, no matter the amount, keeping it stationary through inertia, even as it all moves on that 360 degree curved trajectory, no matter the amount. As long as that circular motion is maintained, that force will also be on every single thing moving with it, on everything connected to that object. Again, any angle, any direction. As long as you have fixed rotation, everything, including water, at any level and in any amount, will remain contained within that object, attached to a spinning object because of the force created by circular motion, attracting and binding it. So we know for sure when different forces are applied to water, it will curve and it will bend and it will move in synchronicity with the rotation of whatever it is placed in. Then you got some people that say, no matter what forces can be demonstrated through physics, there is no force that is going to keep the atmosphere on the planet, that is going to keep the entire atmosphere stuck to the planet and moving with the planet. Because we know the atmosphere is made up of gas particles. In order to have gas pressure, you need a container. Because in order for gas particles to stay in one spot, they need to be sealed inside of some type of container. Because if you put gas particles into any type of open space, they're going to spread throughout all of that open space and try to equalize with all of the available space surrounding it. So how can we have a gaseous atmosphere sticking to the earth while it's sitting in the middle of a vacuum, sitting in the middle of open space? How is the atmosphere being held down on the earth without anything containing it, without anything sealing it in and physically separating it from the vacuum of space? How can we have layers of atmosphere with no container, with no barrier? Because we're supposed to be sitting in the vacuum of space. But if you can't have gas pressure without a container, how can we possibly be sitting out in space? It seems to defy the laws of physics. And if our atmosphere can't sit out in open space, then people say space must be fake, or at least what we know space to be must be fake, because there has to be something physical keeping our atmosphere in, keeping our atmosphere on the earth. But we know when we observe the atmosphere around us, there is very clearly a pressure gradient. When we get to a certain point higher up in the Earth's atmosphere, the atmosphere begins to drastically change. And we can clearly observe as we move higher up, the atmosphere getting thinner. We can see this very clearly when we send balloons into the upper atmosphere. Because when we send balloons up into the upper atmosphere, as they move up further and further into the atmosphere and rise higher and higher in altitude, moving further and further away from the atmosphere on the surface, moving further and further away from the earth, they begin to slowly expand. The further and further they move up in altitude, the more and more they expand. The more and more that helium inside of them expands until they reach as far as they can go, which is about 100,000 feet above the earth, 18 miles above the earth. And once they reach that point, what would be the stratosphere, they continue to expand until they reach their widest point or fullest volume before eventually bursting, before eventually popping at those higher altitudes. Every single helium balloon sent into the upper atmosphere expands into its widest point and eventually bursts, eventually pops at those higher altitudes above the earth. Every helium balloon that makes it past 100,000 feet above the earth expands and bursts. And the average helium balloon sent up to this height only lasts about 2 hours before expanding and bursting. 2 hours at the least, a few weeks at the most. And that's depending on the size. The larger the size, the longer it's going to last. And again, the largest helium balloons only last about 2 weeks at this height above the earth. And if you're really lucky, you might be able to squeeze a month out of these things. But every helium balloon sent up near 100,000 feet above the earth lasts for a short frame of time before expanding and popping, which lets you know that you can't have satellites floating on helium balloons, because you got some people that think that all satellites are actually satelloons, that nothing can actually orbit around the earth. So every satellite is actually floating above the earth on a helium balloon. Again, helium balloons don't last more than a few weeks to a few hours at those higher levels above the earth before that helium gives and that balloon bursts. Again, every helium balloon that is sent up to those higher levels above the earth, sent up past 100,000 feet, 18 miles, expands as far as it can go, as far as it can stretch. The helium gas inside that balloon expands out, though it's trying to escape out from that balloon and spread out into the empty space surrounding it, and eventually bursts, expands as far as it can go, and eventually bursts. And right here on the surface of the earth, if we fill balloons with helium and place those balloons inside a vacuum chamber, which is going to remove all the air, all the atmospheric particles, all the gas particles from that chamber, essentially creating a vacuum, every single balloon in that vacuum chamber expands to its widest point as that helium expands within it before eventually bursting. Every single helium balloon expands inside of that vacuum and eventually bursts. Every single balloon placed into a vacuum chamber, the helium expands within that balloon and the balloon eventually pops. Just like what we see when we send helium balloons into the upper atmosphere and they get 100,000 feet above the earth, 18 miles above the earth. We see those balloons react as if they have been placed inside a vacuum, as if they have moved into an environment with no atmosphere, with no atmospheric particles, with no gas particles. In that environment, that vacuum causes them to expand and burst within that empty space. And this is where a lot of people get confused, because when they think of a vacuum, they immediately think of a vacuum cleaner, something that sucks everything up, which is why a lot of people think the vacuum of space would suck away the Earth's atmosphere. But vacuums don't suck things up. That word vacuum is referring to a completely empty space, a space that has nothing in it, an area with absolutely nothing in it. No particles, no matter, just empty space. And so the vacuum part of a vacuum cleaner is the empty space that things are sent into. That space that has nothing in it is the actual vacuum. The actual vacuum is just the space with nothing in it. Because again, that word vacuum just means emptiness, an empty space, a space that has nothing in it, a space where nothing exists. So basically a void, no matter, no gas, no atmospheric particles. And as we observe the atmosphere on the earth, we can clearly observe the farther we move away from the earth, the higher up we go, the less gas, the less atmospheric particles there seems to be. And the amount of those particles, the amount of that gas seems to thin out more and more. The higher we go up, the further away from the earth we get, until we reach around 100,000 feet above the earth. Again, 18 miles above the earth, where things begin to react just the way they do when they are placed inside a vacuum, placed inside a space with no particles, no atmosphere, placed inside an empty void. And we know this is how we get gas pressure or air pressure. The more gas particles filling a particular space, the more gas pressure, the more air pressure. The less gas particles filling a particular space, the less gas pressure, the less air pressure. Which is why if you place a balloon in a space with more gas pressure, with more air pressure, more gas particles filling the space around it, that balloon is going to shrink because of all that pressure surrounding it. But when you place that balloon in a space with less gas pressure, with less air pressure, less gas particles surrounding it, basically an area with more empty space, that balloon is going to expand as the helium within it, or the gas particles within it, look to expand into all the available space surrounding it, just like they expand in a vacuum. When you remove all the gas, all the particles from that space surrounding it, that balloon reacts by expanding into all of that available empty space. But as soon as you fill that vacuum back up or that empty space back up, increasing the air particles within that space and basically increasing the air pressure within that space, that balloon begins to shrink as it conforms to the air pressure or the gas pressure surrounding it. And again, things sent high above the earth react as if they have been sent into an environment with less gas particles, with less atmospheric particles, as if once they have reached a certain height, they have reached the beginning of a vacuum, the beginning of unfilled, empty space, which is why when we get to this height, around 100,000 feet, they call it the edge of space, because we're very clearly at the edge of a lot more open, unfilled space, the edge of a different environment, the edge of where our atmosphere ends and that void of space begins. And we can see this in other ways because we know all commercial airplanes that fly above 30 to 40,000 feet have to be pressurized. Every single commercial airplane flying at those higher altitudes above the earth has to have air sealed into the cabin of the plane. The inside of every single plane has to be filled with air before they can move up to those higher altitudes. Because again, the higher up we go, the thinner the air gets, the less particles in the air there are. And one of the most abundant gas particles on the earth is oxygen. And once we reach where these planes go, again, 30 to 40,000 feet above the earth, we start to move into an environment where there is a lot less oxygen, where again, the gas particles within the air start to thin out, meaning the oxygen in the air starts to thin out. And so again, because of that, every single commercial airplane that moves to these heights has to have oxygen sealed into the plane. And if they lose cabin pressure, nobody on that plane will survive because of the lack of oxygen in the air at those heights. Which is why on top of that cabin pressure, every single commercial airplane has oxygen cylinders, oxygen generators, basically emergency oxygen, just in case that cabin pressure fails. Every single seat on every single plane is equipped with emergency oxygen connected to oxygen masks, which again, every single person on that plane needs in order to survive at those higher altitudes. Because if that plane loses cabin pressure at 40 to 30,000 feet, there will not be enough oxygen in the air for anyone to survive. And as soon as that cabin pressure is lost, as soon as the oxygen on the plane is lost, that plane has to immediately get down from 40 to 30,000 feet down to 10,000 feet and make an emergency descent down to a safe level. Again, 10,000 feet above the earth. You have more oxygen, breathable air. Because again, above those 10,000 feet, there is a lot less oxygen, a lot less atmosphere, a lot less air, which is another reason why they call it cruising altitude, because there is a lot less air for the plane to move through at those altitudes, 40 to 30,000 feet above the earth, which gives it that ability to cruise. But again, less air means less oxygen. And when we get above 10,000 feet, we cannot last more than 2 minutes without going into shock from a lack of oxygen, from oxygen deprivation, because of how thin the atmosphere is higher up. And that's 30 to 40,000 feet on a commercial airplane. You got jet pilots flying at 40 to 60,000 feet, 10 times higher than commercial airplanes, 40 to 60,000 feet, where the air gets even thinner. Those particles get even less, and the oxygen gets even less, where there is so little oxygen that those pilots need a constant direct stream of it, constantly flowing directly into their lungs, a constant flow of oxygen directly into their lungs. basically what they call pressure demand oxygen, because the oxygen levels are so low and the air is so thin above 40,000 feet and around 60,000 feet. And they actually need 100% supplemental oxygen at these heights. And anything below that, anything below 100% is considered a minimum or low amount. If they're running below 100% supplemental oxygen, they are running below the bare minimum at those heights. And even the planes themselves, the jets themselves, are pressurized with air, with extra oxygen sealed into the jet. So just to be up at this height, they need a pressurized cabin and a pressurized oxygen mask. And that oxygen is connected directly to their helmet, just in case they need to quickly eject at 60 to 40,000 feet. Because again, at those heights where the atmosphere is thinner, they need that constant flow of extra oxygen. Because at 35,000 feet, a person has 60 to 30 seconds to respond to oxygen loss. Because once that oxygen loss hits you, once that oxygen deprivation hits you, brain damage starts within like 1 to 2 minutes. And after 10 minutes, you will not survive. Because again, the higher you go up, the less oxygen there is, the less particles there is, the less atmosphere there is. We can see this at even lower levels, like when people mountain climb, climbing up to higher altitudes, like the Himalayas, Mount Everest, around 29,000 feet, 5 miles up from the earth. When people climb to these heights, they need extra oxygen. Without being in some type of pressurized vehicle, once you reach about 8,000 feet, the average person will start to require extra oxygen because of the lack of oxygen higher up, because of the lack of particles higher up. Everyone eventually succumbs to needing extra oxygen, whether it's on the ascent up or once they reach the peak, the top of that mountain. That need for extra oxygen hits everybody. And once you get at these high mountainous elevations, around 20,000 feet, they actually call this point death zone elevation. Because at this point, about 20,000 feet above the earth, plants stop growing, plants stop taking root. You don't see any animals going higher than this. And for human beings, if we don't have that extra oxygen, we will not survive because of the lack of oxygen, the lack of atmosphere at these higher altitudes. This is the number one reason people do not survive mountain climbing, altitude sickness, because of the lack of oxygen. Because once that lack of oxygen hits you at those heights, you start to feel what they call hypoxia, which is a reaction to the lack of air particles around you, the lack of oxygen around you. And this is where you get people climbing to these heights, suffering from cardiac arrest, strokes, blindness, extreme exhaustion, confusion, a whole deterioration of bodily functions because of the lack of oxygen getting to the brain as a result of moving higher up into that, vacuum-like environment where the air starts to thin out closer to the top of those mountains, which is the reason why every single mountain that stretches up over 20,000 feet is frozen over near the top, near the summit or the peak, because there's a lot less air particles to transfer heat at those heights. And a lot less particles in the air means a lot less particles to retain heat, which means more cold, more freezing for anything at these heights, like mountains. And again, that lack of air particles means a lack of oxygen particles, a lack of breathable atmosphere higher up. And you will not survive camping at these heights without a constant flow of oxygen. You're going to need multiple cylinders of oxygen to survive the full climb up and the full descent down. The average person is going to need about 8 cylinders of oxygen. And that's for like a seasoned climber. You got some people that do need less. Everybody needs that extra oxygen when they hit that peak, when they hit the top of that mountain. And it's the same thing with skydivers. 14,000 feet and below is usually, pretty safe for people to dive without extra oxygen. 14,000 feet, around 2 miles. Any skydiving beyond 15,000 feet, getting closer to over 2 miles, that's when for the average person, oxygen starts to become recommended. And any skydiving beyond 20,000 feet, that death zone, oxygen is pretty much required. Once you start jumping from 20,000 feet or higher, 3 miles up or higher, you are required to have that extra oxygen. And before you even jump, all high altitude skydiving requires extra oxygen tanks on the aircraft itself. And you have to breathe in at least 30 minutes worth of 100% pre-oxygen before you jump into that thin atmosphere. Because again, we know the human brain needs oxygen, the human blood needs oxygen, which is only available in small trace amounts at higher altitudes. Because you got to think, a high altitude jump at around 40,000 feet, 7 miles up, takes about 2 minutes. And just within those 2 minutes, if you do not have supplementary oxygen, extra oxygen, you can very quickly suffocate at those higher altitudes. At the very least, you have the risk of potentially passing out, losing consciousness, if you don't have that extra oxygen while making a jump through the atmosphere above 20,000 feet. Because above 20,000 feet, there's not enough oxygen, enough atmosphere to sustain you. Because again, the higher we go up, the less particles filling the air, the less particles creating the atmosphere, the less particles we have clustered together, creating the air pressure, which is why when people skydive, or even when we just move up higher, we feel our ears pop. As soon as we reach a certain height, our ears start to pop. And usually for skydiving, that threshold is at about 20,000 feet. They feel that pressure release from their ears as the air pressure around them starts to release or starts to decrease higher up. The air is colder higher up. People are moving through colder air when they skydive. Once you reach about 3,000 feet above the earth, the temperature drops 10 degrees and it just continues to drop the higher you go up. Because again, at those higher altitudes, there are less air particles to retain and transfer heat into the atmosphere. So with skydiving, it is clear that we are moving through a layered atmosphere, an atmosphere that is decreasing the higher you move into it. Less and less oxygen, the higher you move into it. Less and less air, the higher you move into it, meaning less and less air pressure, keeping the atmosphere pressed down on the earth, the higher you move above the earth. And we know this is happening, that the air pressure is decreasing the higher we go up, and that the particles in the air are decreasing the higher we go up. That the air pressure is decreasing because we can send a barometer, a tool that measures air pressure, into the upper atmosphere and literally watch the pressure within the atmosphere continually decrease. The higher that barometer goes up, the higher that barometer moves into the upper atmosphere, the more and more the pressure within the air decreases. Until again, we reach 100,000 feet above the earth, what would be the stratosphere, point above the earth, where that barometer gets extremely close to zero, a point where the air pressure gets extremely close to zero, meaning zero air pressure, zero oxygen, zero atmosphere, basically a vacuum, a space with nothing in it. When we send those barometers up, there is no doubt that we are leaving the atmosphere of the earth and moving into a completely different environment, while the atmosphere of the earth sits down below on the earth, separately from that different environment, without a container, staying on the earth with no physical container holding it in, keeping it in. The atmosphere of the earth separated from that near vacuum above it, creating that gradient where we gradually move from the atmosphere on the earth into all of that open space. We can see that it's that pressure being placed on the air particles, creating that gradient. In other words, that pressure gradient, where the pressure pressing the atmosphere down onto the earth slowly lets up, slowly decreases the higher you move above it. So we know the atmosphere and all the gas particles forming it are being pressed down onto the earth separately from the environment above it. And obviously, all that pressure of these air particles being pressed down is giving them weight. So we can assume the pressure of all those particles is weighing them down onto the surface of the earth, separately from the open space above it. We can see how this would work with other gases, like sulfur hexafluoride, which is an extremely dense gas. It's actually 6 times denser than the air we breathe, because you got a lot of molecules forming that gas, bringing that gas together, bringing it together and giving it weight, keeping it pressed down and separated from the surrounding air around it, creating air pressure without a container, which we can see when we place lighter objects on top of it, objects with a lot less weight on top of that gas. We can literally see the gradient between the gas and the air around it, where the gradient between the gas and the surrounding air begins, from all the air particles being clustered together, giving it that weight, giving it so much weight or so much pressure that we can actually scoop that gas out and dump it on top of the object sitting on top of it. Because that gas has so much weight, so much pressure, we can literally scoop it into a cup and relocate it, move it to a different spot or a different position. Literally pick the gas up and dump it on top of that object until the weight of that gas causes the object to sink and become weighed down within that dense, gaseous environment. And we can pull that lighter object back out, removing it from that environment and removing all of that gas from it by dumping or pouring it back in, basically pouring it back with the rest of that gas. And once all of that dense air is removed, we can sit it right back exactly where it was, right where, again, that gradient begins, where the pressure holding down that dense gaseous environment begins. Just like that gradient, about 100,000 feet above the earth, right at the edge of space, separating the atmosphere of the earth from all of the open space beyond it, because of all of that atmospheric pressure weighing the atmosphere down. Now, obviously, with sulfur hexafluoride, we're dealing with an extremely dense gas that is naturally dense, naturally heavy. It's a super dense, super heavy gas by nature. While when you're dealing with the gases in our atmosphere, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, you're dealing with much lighter gases that are a lot lighter than, sulfur hexafluoride. Nitrogen, which is in our atmosphere the most, is super light. It's almost got no weight to it. And the heaviest gas in our atmosphere that we need to survive is carbon dioxide, which is still a whole lot lighter than sulfur hexafluoride. Carbon dioxide has a molecular mass of 44, while sulfur hexafluoride has a molecular mass of 146. So it's like 100% heavier than the heaviest gas in our atmosphere. That's why they call it anti-helium, because it's actually 6 times heavier than helium. But even though it's way heavier than any of the gases in our atmosphere, it's actually just as stable as every single gas in our atmosphere. Literally, the gases in our atmosphere and sulfur hexafluoride have the same level of stability, that same firmness or solid attraction to the surface, keeping them stable on the surface. The only difference is sulfur hexafluoride is naturally dense, naturally heavy, naturally stable, while the gases within our atmosphere are not. None of the gases in our atmosphere have a large enough molecular weight to naturally weigh them down onto a surface and keep them weighed down onto that surface. All of these gases within our atmosphere, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, oxygen, have a natural tendency to rise and to spread out and spread up as far as they can go. You know, if you release oxygen into a room or a building, it's going to spread throughout the entire room or the entire building, from the floor all the way to the ceiling, until it fills every bit of available space up. It's not just going to sink down and create this dense gradient of oxygen that only makes it halfway up to the ceiling, that only fills up half the room. You know, it's going to rise and spread everywhere. So because the gases within our atmosphere all have a natural tendency to rise and spread into all of the available space around them, we have to assume what is keeping all of the oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and every other gas within our atmosphere pressed down onto the earth separately from the open space above it is some type of force. That there is something on the earth that is attracting those gases, attracting them strictly to the surface of the earth, pressing them down, creating that air pressure, and giving the atmosphere weight that it would normally have. Because we know we've got that slow gradient where the weight of the atmosphere slowly decreases higher and higher up. The higher we go up, the less weight there is, the less and less pressure there is, almost as if something is pulling the atmosphere toward the earth. And that pull or that force is stronger on the surface of the earth. And it's at its absolute weakest away from the earth, where we hit that vacuum, which again is creating that clear gradient, that clear line between our atmosphere and the void of all that space above it. Helium balloons rise within that sulfur hexafluoride, rise up slowly to the surface of it. The helium pushes through that gas, stops right at the top of that gas, right at the gradient of that pressure, just like helium balloons rise up through the Earth's atmosphere before they eventually stop and sit at the gradient at around 100,000 feet above the Earth. The only difference being that when they reach the Earth's gradient, when they reach that line between our atmosphere and everything beyond it, they all eventually pop. They all eventually burst when they get there, letting us know we've reached that vacuum, letting us know we've reached a point where the atmosphere of the Earth ends and open space begins. The pressure of whatever is attracting the atmosphere to the surface of the Earth really starts to let up, starts to decrease, where we hit that gradient or that clear line in the sand between the particles making up our atmosphere, that massive void beyond it, a large amount of open space beyond the Earth. We very clearly have the particles in the atmosphere pressed down onto the surface of the Earth, weighed down onto the surface of the Earth. with no container at all, which is why a dome covering the earth and keeping the atmosphere in and keeping it from flying away from the planet doesn't make sense. First off, in order for there to be a dome over the earth while it sits flat, we have to pretend that the southern hemisphere and everything that everyone who lives there experiences doesn't exist. We have to pretend that the equator and everything that everyone who lives there experiences doesn't exist, because you can't have a southern hemisphere or an equator where completely different things are happening at the same time on a flat, two-dimensional earth with a dome over the top of it. You can't have the sun and the moon rising in the east and immediately setting in the west at the same time on an earth where everything is laid out flat with a dome over the top of it. Then you've also got to think about this. If there is a dome over the earth, literally sitting over the earth like a capsule, sealing everything in, that means that the atmosphere is being held inside a container. That dome would basically be a container, sealing the gases of the atmosphere in. And you got to think about how gas placed inside a container works. When you place gas inside a container, especially gases like the ones in our atmosphere, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, those gases are going to naturally rise and naturally spread throughout that entire container until they fill every bit of space within that container. And where the gas ends is going to be where the container ends. Where the container seals everything in, stops and seals everything in, is where the gas is going to stop and be sealed in. Because again, that gas is going to rise and spread until it presses against the walls of that container, sealing the gas in and creating gas pressure inside a container. When a physical object or a physical container is sealing gas in, those particles stop wherever that container holding them in stops. They don't drop down in the container and just randomly pile up halfway from the top of the container. Gases are going to naturally spread out and rise upward until they press against whatever is sealing them in, which is why smoke detectors are on the ceiling inside of buildings, because smoke, one of the most common gases, spreads out and rises up at the highest point of whatever is containing it, because it's the natural function of most gases to rise and spread as far as they can go, to rise and spread to the furthest possible boundary of the physical object that they are being contained in, to spread out equally throughout that entire object to the outermost points of it, pressing against the physical boundaries of it. And as soon as you take away that containment, releasing that physical pressure, basically removing the lid, holding the gas in, that gas continues to rise and continues to spread as far as it can possibly go until it reaches another physical barrier. So if there is a physical dome sitting on top of the earth that is holding the atmosphere in, a physical dome that is keeping the atmosphere on the earth, then the atmosphere should be pressing against the walls of the dome. We should have the gas of the atmosphere pressing against all parts of the dome, all the way to the very top of the dome, meaning everywhere on the earth and everywhere beyond the earth, right up until you reach the physical walls of the dome, from top to bottom, should be filled with the gases of the atmosphere that are rising and spreading through it. The dome should be filled with oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and every inert gas in our atmosphere until you reach the boundary of the enclosure of the dome, keeping it all in, meaning no matter how high you go above the earth, you will be moving through the atmosphere that is being held in by the dome, meaning that we should be able to fly planes and jets above the earth through the contained atmosphere all the way to the top of the dome with no need for extra oxygen, no need for pressurization, because you'd be moving through one equal layer of pressure until you reach the walls of the dome. We should be able to get in a helicopter and let it lift up and rise above the earth until we reach the end of the dome, where all the air is being sealed in. We should be able to get in a hot air balloon and rise all the way up to the highest point of the dome without having to worry about wearing an oxygen mask, and never have to worry about the balloon collapsing or the flame being lost, no matter how high we go up, because the atmosphere is physically contained. We should be able to send helium balloons up, and they should be able to rise up through the atmosphere all the way to the end of the dome. They shouldn't be rising to 100,000 feet, stopping at 100,000 feet, expanding and exploding. They should be rising up through that contained air, that contained atmosphere, until they literally hit the dome. The only thing stopping them from rising any higher should be the walls of the physical dome itself, because that dome would be creating its own contained environment, its own equally pressurized environment. There should be no death zone elevation above 20,000 feet. There should be no point above the earth where plants and trees stop growing. Plants and trees should be rising through all of the carbon dioxide and oxygen under the dome toward the light rays of the sun, the local sun. If the sun is local, hovering right there over the top of the flat earth, or sitting just outside the dome, shining its very close light rays over the top of the earth, literally sitting within our atmosphere or sitting just outside of our atmosphere, photosynthesis should be happening at all levels, at all altitudes, because all of the carbon dioxide filling up the dome should be transferring the radiation of the sun all throughout the dome. Mount Everest and every single mountain at a high altitude should look like a jungle or a rainforest. We should be seeing nothing but greenery the higher we go up, especially mountains that are close to the local sun. Plants and trees should be thriving at high altitudes because of all of the carbon dioxide and oxygen rising up through the dome under the very close, very local sun. The peak of these 20,000 foot mountains shouldn't be freezing over with no life present on them. Again, there should be no death zone elevation where our atmosphere drastically thins out. That carbon dioxide should be rising and spreading until it hits the boundaries of the dome. Those molecules of oxygen should be rising and spreading until they hit the boundaries of the dome. We should be seeing birds, bats, butterflies, anything with wings, flying above 40,000 feet near the top of the dome that is physically holding the atmosphere in. We should be able to send cameras up above 40,000 feet and watch birds, bats, butterflies, moths, and everything else flying past the camera as they fly through the higher layers of the dome that is keeping the atmosphere in, flying through the oxygen that the dome is holding in. No one should need oxygen masks higher up. We should be able to go up as high as we want without needing any extra oxygen until we reach the very top of the dome, moving through that evenly distributed atmosphere under the dome. We shouldn't see a black void when we start to move up above and away from the earth. We should still continue to see the atmosphere that the dome is sealing in. Even as we move away from the earth, we should see the contained atmosphere still interacting with the sun, still creating the same atmospheric haze that we see on the earth, even when we go up higher above the earth, as we move up through the dome. Because the atmospheric particles that are being sealed in by the dome should still be interacting with the sun that is sitting right above the dome or right under the dome. We shouldn't be going higher up and drastically shifting from the haze of our atmosphere into a seemingly endless black void, like we actually do when we start to move above the earth. If the earth is stationary and motionless, with the dome sitting over the top of it, sealing everything into this airtight environment, we should not have wind, because air pressure, the distribution of the air throughout the earth, would have to be equal everywhere, from the top of the dome to the flat ground below, with no high or low pressure, no variations in the levels of the distribution of the air to create wind, no friction or movement to generate air currents in the atmosphere, because you would have stagnant, sealed gas inside of a stationary, motionless object. It's just like when you seal gas into any other object, the gas doesn't just randomly build up a current or randomly form different layers of pressure. That's why there's only one pressure gauge on a tank of gas, because there's only one level of even pressure throughout gas that is sealed inside a physical object. And you're not going to get these abrupt movements and motions from gas that's sealed and contained airtight inside an object that's sitting on a flat, motionless surface. Because again, when gas is enclosed inside a physical object, you're always going to have one single layer of gas, one even single layer of gas spread out equally throughout that entire object. We can see this with actual biodomes, biospheres, and terrariums, airtight, pressurized habitats that keep those environments sealed in and totally contained. The air inside those domes is equally distributed all throughout them, from the top of the roof to the bottom of the floor. The air doesn't suddenly completely thin out the higher you go up inside of them. There is no pressure gradient inside a biodome beyond the pressure that the actual walls of the dome is creating on the air that it is physically holding in, because that air is fully enclosed. It is evenly distributed throughout that entire enclosed space, meaning every part of that biodome, biosphere, or terrarium is fully oxygenated, is filled with oxygen, no matter how high or how low. Which is why when you get up to a high altitude inside that biodome, you don't experience oxygen loss, oxygen shortage. You don't start suffering from hypoxia. You don't all of a sudden need an oxygen mask to breathe just because you went up higher inside the enclosed dome environment. No matter how high you go up, the spread of that oxygen is supported by the dome, by the container holding it in. No matter how high up you go, the spread of that oxygen is being supported by the dome. Because it's airtight and pressurized, you can take a balloon all the way to the top of the biodome and not have to worry about it expanding and exploding at the higher levels of the enclosed dome. You don't have to worry about the balloon being influenced by any sudden changes in air pressure, because it is moving through one even layer of air all the way throughout. There is no death zone where plants stop growing, where things start to freeze over and get colder. because there is oxygen and carbon dioxide all throughout the dome for those plants to thrive and grow, all the way to the top of the enclosed dome where the environment is being physically sealed in. So again, if there is a physical dome sitting over the earth, holding everything in, we should be able to move up as high as we can in the dome until we reach the physical walls of the dome, just like we can do in an actual enclosed biodome that is sealing an environment in. And then we know if there is a physical dome over the top of us, we shouldn't have meteors. When we look at the sky above us, we can see dozens upon dozens of shooting stars moving through space, constantly moving through space from all directions, from the left, from the right, from the sides, shooting down from above, shooting up from below. These shooting stars are moving around the earth in all directions, from all angles, which if they're coming up from below the horizon, which we know there are, we can clearly see them shooting up from below the horizon, you already have to come to one of two conclusions. Either they are moving around the earth, around the bottom half of the spherical earth that is sitting in the same space with them, or they are randomly materializing from the lower realms below the flat earth, but somehow have the same qualities, same movements, and are moving at the same speed as the ones coming from all the other directions. And then you would also have to assume that the stars are also dropping down into the lower realms of the flat earth and disappearing into who knows where. But again, we see all of these shooting stars. We see them moving all around the earth. And ever so often, we even see them crashing into the earth as meteors.